The role and significance of Martin Luther King to the civil rights movement is probably not possible to understate, and it's probably not possible to actually explain it in this kind of 10-minute tutorial. But we'll do our best. Little bit of background first, just who MLK, who Martin Luther King, who Martin Luther King actually was. Who MLK was. So first of all, he was his background was he was born in Atlanta in Georgia, which is actually in the south of the United States. It was right in one of those tough areas to live, really. He was born into a middle-class home, and he actually attended university, which was quite a rare thing, really, in those days for a black person to do. But he was educated, and he was used to the prejudice coming from Atlanta. He was used to the prejudice, the racial prejudice that people were experiencing. He later went on to become a Baptist minister, which is basically like a priest. He would stand up in church and he would make speeches. He would worship God. He was very, very serious about his faith. Very serious about his faith. He believed sincerely in the biblical principles, in the principles that were in the Bible of love and respect and humanity, and he would play those out in his daily life wherever possible. He was a very humble man, but he would not be intimidated by anybody, and that came across early on in his activities. And two of his biggest influences were Gandhi and Jesus himself. So Gandhi for his peaceful protest against British rule in India, and Jesus, who of course came out with his favorite phrase, I was going to say, but one of his most famous phrases, which was the idea that an eye for an eye, the idea that an eye for an eye is dead, is the old law, and that now you should turn the other cheek when somebody is aggressive towards you. And Martin Luther King wholeheartedly embraced that philosophy, and he looked at the tactics really that Gandhi had used, not just what he was campaigning for, which was against British rule in India, but he looked at these peaceful methods that Gandhi was using. So he was very heavily influenced by those two, and that influence rubbed off when he actually created the SCLC. So this was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and this was an organisation that was expressly set up really to get civil rights, for black people, and it was made up of Christians, and particularly Christian leaders. Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister. This organisation was also made up of other people high up in different churches. And one of the first things that the SCLC did was to arrange in April 1963 the March on Birmingham. Now, Birmingham, Alabama, as we've already heard in previous tutorials, was a place where racism, segregation, prejudice against black people was commonplace. And the man really, I suppose, who symbolised that was a guy called Eugene Connor, or Eugene, nickname Eugene the Bull Connor, who was essentially a racist thug in charge of Birmingham, Alabama. And Eugene Connor was determined that public places in Birmingham, so that swimming pools, parks, anything like that, was not going to be desegregated. He was determined that that was not going to happen, and he publicly said that. And as soon as people actually started turning up for this march, people were arrested, and Martin Luther King was arrested, and he was sent to jail in Birmingham. And that's where he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which you can see a little excerpt of now on screen.
There he wrote a passionate and angry letter to explain the reasons behind the civil rights movement. He didn't have any writing paper, so he wrote on the margins of a newspaper and on toilet paper.
Your first name becomes nigger. Your middle name becomes boy, however old you are. Then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait.
King's letter from a Birmingham jail was an indictment of American society for permitting racism to continue. But it ended with hope.
We will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation, because the goal of America is freedom.
He talked about freedom as the American ideal, and then turned around and said, well, now blacks want to be part of that. He was asking white Americans, in a sense, to finally, after hundreds of years, confront this contradiction. They believed in freedom, and yet they denied freedom to African Americans.
When he wrote this letter, it became very well known nationally. It was almost like a battle cry to say, listen, we're not going to tolerate this kind of treatment anymore. And it was incredibly well written as well. And he actually wrote it on toilet paper, funnily enough, because there wasn't any paper there for him to write on in jail. In the meantime, the march went ahead in Birmingham, and Eugene Bull Connor used dogs and police sprays. They would spray people with these huge water cannons, which actually knocked people off their feet. Vicious dogs attacked young people. Teenagers had to be taken to hospital with bites, chunks that had been taken out of their legs from these ravenous dogs. Eugene Connor was serious about stopping it. And you know, in some ways he succeeded, because he just closed all the parks and he closed all the public places to prevent the black people from actually using them. Now, all of this, funnily enough, all this use of dogs and sprays was televised, and the president watched it. JFK watched it on TV, and JFK was a great fan and admirer of Martin Luther King. And when he saw what was going on here in April 1963, his next step was to propose the Civil Rights Bill. He proposed the Civil Rights Bill, which would basically ban segregation in all public places across the United States if it was actually passed. There would obviously be a big fight to actually pass it. Now, once this march was over, they decided we need to organise a bigger march to make an even bigger statement. And this time, they would go to Washington, the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. And they would go there in August 1963, so a few months later. And this time, there were 250,000 people turning up. So it was a much bigger march than the April 1963 march on Birmingham. A lot more people turned up. 250,000 people turned up to see this. They marched to the Lincoln Memorial in the centre of Washington to hear speeches. And one of those speeches was made by Martin Luther King, and he made his incredibly famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech, which basically said, this is my vision. This is my vision for black people in terms of what I want black people to achieve and for black people to have. Now, that's all well and good, but actually very little changed after the March on Washington. Again, it was televised. It got a lot of reaction. Global audiences also watched it. And people really were siding with Martin Luther King. Unfortunately, there was a blow, and that came in late 1963, when, unfortunately, JFK was assassinated in late 1963. JFK was assassinated. He was one of the biggest supporters of Martin Luther King's campaign, and when you got the president on your side, it obviously helps. Lyndon Johnson replaced President Kennedy as president of the United States, and he passed in 1964 the Civil Rights Act, which was followed in 1965 by the Voting Rights Act, which, if you think about it, was actually more important because it actually gave black people the right to vote, which they were being blocked from doing by very clever tactics, and you can see that in the 1930s tutorial. So real breakthroughs coming in the mid 1960s, but still a heck of a lot of racism going on. And in the meantime, after the March on Washington, the next couple of years, Martin Luther King broadens his scope and he begins attacking the war in Vietnam and the fact that lots of black soldiers were fighting in the Vietnam War for America. He didn't agree with the war itself, but he also didn't agree with black soldiers fighting for America at a time when they weren't getting the rights they deserved at home. Unfortunately, as you probably know, in 1968, MLK was assassinated. His life came to an end. A sniper shot him at a hotel, and you know, that was it. In Memphis, it was in Memphis, Tennessee. In Memphis, he was shot on a hotel balcony by a sniper, by a white supremacist, and unfortunately, he died. So, some people will say, well, what impact did he have? Well, you can see on there, he was leading all of this. He was driving all of this, and particularly these two famous marches, which led to these really, really important bits of legislation, which helped black people so much.